Young Africans, like in many parts of the world, have been organizing online and marching in the streets to protest against the rising cost of living, government corruption, and demanding economic, social, and climate justice. Let's take a look at what's been going on. The youth-led nationwide protests in Kenya that began in June have led to the scrapping of a finance bill that introduced controversial tax hikes. Demonstrators now want the president to resign after he sacked his entire cabinet and the attorney general, and they are calling for justice for the dozens of unarmed protesters that have been killed by security forces. In 2015 and 2016, students in South Africa led nationwide protests under the Fees Must Fall movement, demanding free and quality higher education. Student registration fees were scrapped as a result, and the government introduced a scheme to help students from poor families pay their tuition. In 2018, the chant on the streets and online was Tasgut Bas in Arabic, which translates to just fall, calling for the removal of Omar al-Bashir's decades-old leadership. He was toppled by the military a year later and transitional government installed, but two rival generals have since plunged the country into a civil war. While in October 2020, young Nigerians protesting against police brutality using the hashtag #EndSARS led to the disbanding of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, but they were brutally suppressed after soldiers shot at unarmed dissidents, killing dozens. In 2021, street protests in Ghana were fueled by the country's cost of living crisis and the Fix the Country youth movement, demanding an end to corruption and economic mismanagement. A planned three-day protest at the seat of government in September last year was forcefully dispersed by police. Let's hear more from Joseph Ochieno, who is a writer and commentator on African affairs. He joins me from Uganda's capital, Kampala. Thank you for joining us here on Africa Matters. Is youth activism on the rise across Africa, and what's driving it?
You're absolutely right. It's on the rise, but there are many, many reasons. But if you go back to Kenya, I think the youth uprisings and protests were on the back of an election a process that took place 2 years ago that were not fundamentally and properly resolved. They were contested, and so while the president there won and was sworn in, the results were contested, and so therefore Kenya is generally a divided nation, almost 50-50. And number two, the main Kenyan opposition carried out demonstrations, pickets, and rallies across the country last year, what they called cost of living protests. So therefore, Kenya is generally charged. The majority of the population, both young and old, know about cost of livings. But then why these protests at this time? I think a number of factors. One is the, if you like, clearly fundamental failure of the IMF, World Bank, or if you like, neoliberal agenda that was imposed on the continent over the last 20 to 30 years, that African governments swallowed almost without negotiations, without deals, without critical thought, number one. And number two, as you suggest, quite clearly, rampant corruption across the continent. But then number three, quite clear failure of leadership, one across the continent, and then two in those respective African countries where governments have not really engaged their population, nor have they put most of the monies into priorities that would particularly cater for generally youth-related projects.
All right.
But beyond that, sorry.
But we've seen peaceful youth-led protests violently quashed by security forces. Are young people being given the space they need to voice their concerns and demands?
To an extent, yes, but it's also relative. Protests in Uganda have been rapidly crushed. There is a pending one in the next few weeks. We will wait and see how it goes. In Kenya itself, has had generally peaceful protests, but we know at the end of the day, that fateful day where over 40 young Kenyans died really needlessly, and so therefore brutally suppressed. It's interesting that on that day, the president came on television and called these guys criminals. I think overnight, in a way, it did not help him, and by end of the day, the following day, he had actually caved in, and that is part of what led to where we are in Kenya today. Would it happen in Rwanda? Almost certainly no. Would it happen in some other African countries? I can think of counting one or two, three of them. Possibly not. But generally, yes, in South Africa, by and large, they will take place, and they would not necessarily be major kind of blood-led repercussions, as we've seen partly in Kenya. So really, there are mixed reviews. In Nigeria, it's also equally mixed. Generally, what's important is that young Africans are beginning to come up and, if you like, make their voices, take positions, unlike the impressive ones in Kenya, where, if you like, they bring out their mini manifestos. And so they're so clear, so fantastic, so specific that you possibly would ask them to be your equivalent of Minister for Planning or Minister for Finance, rather detailed, but as I said, quite clearly focused.
Right. And, it appears that protests have mixed results in the long term. How can young people maintain the momentum and effect meaningful change beyond the protest?
I think you're right. It's important that they go through the protests and hopefully manage to get through them without unnecessary loss of lives. They should be focused. They should be having leaders that are able to engage and focus them towards, if you like, making their cases rather than destroying property, to particularly give rather normally ruthless regimes and or police the right and, if you like, the excuse to rebut. But it is to deal with them brutally. But beyond that, you're absolutely right. Young people, and some of us away from this job, we campaign substantially to encourage young Africans to get involved in politics, to get involved in national issues, the kind that young Kenyans are talking about, to question how their tax dollars are used, to question the priorities of government, to question how, if you like, the opulent African elites are substantially spending over and above their means, to make sure that, well, when it comes to question of elections, not only do they get actively represented, but they get actively involved, meaning, therefore, that eventual governments that come out are legitimate and generally representative of their interests. So that's what young Africans need to do. But young Africans continued to support, the early part of our independence and liberation. And many of these guys emerged to become young leaders on the continent. And in a way, they pushed for change.
But then the question would be, like we've seen, protesters have termed it as intimidation, where we've seen abductions, fatalities, injuries, happening during this time of the protest.
You're absolutely right. But as I said, in that case, they need to focus. And I think the guys to be questioned are not young people. The guys to be questioned are actually the authorities of state. I said at the early stages, particularly on the day when the Kenyan massacre did take place, that I didn't expect to see in this day and age in a country like Kenya. I don't want to see it in a country like Uganda or anywhere on the African continent, a young African who basically seeks to demand, for by and large, what is right of them, to be returned like into coffins. So it should be unacceptable. So in my opinion, where these guys are actually, if you like, tortured and there's a brutality, there should be really a genuine new wave for, if you like, mini African revolution. In any case, actually, most of these protests are a result of, as I said, structural adjustments pushed by IMF and World Bank, but by governments that were substantially irresponsible. And they've created, if you like, excess debt that they cannot sustain. And when it comes to debt rescheduling, like the Kenyan president was trying to do, they begin to focus on taxing the poorest of the poor rather than reviewing their policies, particularly starting from the top opulence of the top privileged lot in governments and in power. I think that is a conversation that we need to have on the entire continent. But finally, quickly, very much a question of corruption across the continent. In Uganda's case, it's estimated that perhaps up to $3 billion is lost per annum through corruption. That's a huge amount of money that, if you spread across the continent, that's the kind of money that we need per annum, if you like, to up our infrastructure development as a continent to catch up with the rest of the world.
All right, Joseph Ochieno, who is a writer and commentator on Africa Affairs, thank you for talking to us here on Africa Matters. Still to come here on Africa Matters.
I am Isaac Kaleji in Accra with more on how businesses and ordinary citizens in Ghana are coping as the government continues to seek solutions to its debt crisis.
On July 15th, protesters marched in the streets of Butembo, a major commercial city in the province of North Kivu in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for a different reason. They're not happy about the advance of the M23 rebels and the killings by Ugandan ADF terrorists. Zanem Neti Zaidi has more from Goma.
The commercial town of Butembo came to a standstill as demonstrators denounced armed groups in the region. The protesters say it is time for the authorities to bring peace to the region and say no to alleged Rwandan armed attacks.
We took to the streets to say that we don't want Rwandan aggression under the guise of the M23 rebellion. We don't want our region to be fought over. We don't want war. We condemn the passivity of the international community, which is silent in the face of the massacres in the region.
Those protesting took to the streets as a government delegation led by the Minister of Interior and Security visited Butembo.
We want peace because we don't have peace in this region. We think that with these demonstrations, with everyone's help, we'll find a solution.
The M23 rebels have captured several villages in Lubero territory, trying to get closer to the town of Butembo, which the UN accuses Rwanda of backing. This region is also in the grip of the Daesh-linked ADF, Armed Democratic Forces, a Ugandan armed group that has attacked the people with weapons and machetes. That despite a joint military operation by Ugandan and Congolese forces against ADF rebels that began in 2021.
Civil society says it is concerned that the government does not seem to take security seriously here in North Kivu province. It plans to call further demonstrations in the coming days.
Over and above the alerts issued by civil society, the state security services also need to work to get to know the situation better. When we are not listened to, we ask the population to demonstrate so that they are listened to and so that the situation can change.
A change that will bring an end to decades of fighting between armed groups over lucrative gold and mineral deposits in the region, and allow the millions of displaced people to go back home. Zanemneti Zaidi, Africa Matters, Goma.
Nigerian authorities have approved more than $22 million worth of interest-free loans to provide financial support and monthly upkeep allowances for 70,000 successful applicants of a national students' loan scheme introduced last year. The initiative targets about 1.2 million students across more than 200 tertiary institutions in its initial phase and has a lenient post-graduation repayment plan. But some say student loans could be used as a debt trap, as Timothy Obiezu reports from Abuja.
For 3 years, media arts student Raphael Osagi has struggled to pay his tuition and living expenses. Raised by a single mother, he even worked menial jobs during the holidays sometimes to help out with his school fees. But last month, he learned about the Nigerian Students' Loan Scheme on social media and decided to apply.
It's a very good one because it will help many youth out there to have this zeal of furthering their education and try to chase their dreams, because it's not, I would say, it's not getting any easy for students and youth, to be precise, because this loan now, it's a very great opportunity.
The National Education Loan Fund says it's received more than 130,000 applications since the student loan portal opened in late May, following a launch last year. So far, 70,000 applicants, including Osagi, have been vetted and approved to receive money for tuition, coursework, and upkeep. Authorities say the initiative is one way to keep students focused and help families cope with the soaring cost of living.
It's pretty good going. We're seeing something like 2,000 applications a day, which is really encouraging because we're obviously vetting these applications for eligibility and for qualifying criteria. So yes, it's going pretty well. Our target is to have about 300,000 by the end of the year.
But some are skeptical about the scheme's success, including the Nigerian Workers' Union. The union has been at loggerheads with authorities over unpaid salaries and poor working conditions for its members. Nigeria's education sector has struggled with chronic underfunding for decades. And despite commitments to improve the national budget for education, the actual disbursement often falls short.
Where you have the highest unemployment rate in the world, youth unemployment rate in the world, Nigeria has that record at the moment. A number of questions inevitably arise. Where will these students get money to pay back?
If they don't have a job after the 2 years, they don't have to pay back. And the point at which they start paying back, it's not the individual that's expected to pay back, it's the employer who goes to the registry to see whether the individual has a loan. And if they do, they make direct deductions, 10% of that person's income back to the fund. There's no criminality if you can't pay back.
The government says with more funding available, more students will get trained, get jobs, and generate taxes for the government to reinvest into the scheme, giving young people the safety net they need to get ahead. Timothy Obiezu, Africa Matters, Abuja, Nigeria.
Ghanaians are also trying to get ahead as the country deals with a debt crisis that has sparked its worst recession in decades. It recently secured a deal to restructure around $13 billion of its foreign debt. But businesses and ordinary people are left to deal with the crisis on their own. Isaac Kaleji reports from the capital, Accra.
Christiana Esel Mensah runs this small bakery in Ghana's Upper East regional town of Bolgatanga. Nowadays, she barely makes any profit due to Ghana's worsening economic crisis.
20. And this one. It is very difficult these days. We are only trying to break even and for the business to stand. But for making outrageous profits is not more there these days. Flour, the cost of flour has gone up, sugar has gone up, margarine has gone up, everything. And you know, when these things, these are the main ingredients that you use. So when it happens like that, you see that it affects the business so much.
It is not just business owners like Christiana who are struggling. Sule Enusa, a university graduate who offers mobile money transaction services in Tamale, doesn't make much either.
For the past, let me see, 4 years, I've not bought any, let's see, personal things like clothing and other things. Any money I get is on what? On food. Because you need to satisfy those needs before you now think of you getting a nice perfume, a nice trousers, or a nice sandals.
Ghana's economy has been on a bad footing for the past 4 years, triggered by a major debt crisis. About half of its current $42.7 billion public debt is owed to external creditors. Just last month, the government secured a vital deal to restructure that debt.
We've reached agreement with the official creditors, bilateral creditors, on the restructuring of $5.1 billion. This will lead to debt service relief of $2.8 billion between 2023 and 2026. We have also reached agreement with our Eurobond holders on the restructuring of $13.1 billion, which will lead to the cancellation of $4.7 billion of our debts and provide debt service relief of $4.4 billion between 2023 and 2026.
Analysts say a deal could now give the government a chance to implement its economic recovery program under the IMF.
So what it means is that obligations that are due for payment will be deferred to, the subsequent year. So it allows the government to accumulate resources to be able to meet repayment in the near future. And that resources could be channeled into other sectors of the economy to manage the overall macroeconomic environment of the economy. So that is giving you a temporary peace of mind to be able to plan better.
Ghana turned to the IMF for support in 2022 as it struggled to service its debts largely caused by excessive borrowing. It has taken 2 years to reach a deal with external creditors so the country can have some cash flow relief up until 2026 when the IMF program ends. But it is not out of the woods. High taxes, inflation, and the depreciation of the local currency, the cedi, continue to worsen the plight of ordinary citizens.
The government has promised to fix the economic crisis, but for businesses like that of Menses, time may be running out. Isaac Kalaji, Africa Matters, Accra, Ghana.
The war in Sudan has had far-reaching implications on neighboring South Sudan's economy, especially after an oil pipeline ruptured in February. This has resulted in a rapidly tanking economy and high inflation in South Sudan, where oil accounts for most of its exports. Our correspondent Rahul has more.
Businesses in South Sudan's capital are counting their losses. Inflation in the country is soaring. It's a crisis affecting everyone in Juba's biggest market.
I myself, there's nothing we are getting. We are just managing. We are managing the situation to see that things stabilize. But I myself, I'm not getting anything. It's just to maintain customers.
Her customers are also trying to make ends meet as the country's oil-dependent economy reels from revenue losses due to the war in neighboring Sudan.
Now, a customer who used to take from my table 1 kilo is now taking half kilo. And that one taking half kilo is taking a quarter. The one you found here, I was selling to, these are the people who are taking half kilo. And that one who was taking a quarter is no more coming now.
In February, a key pipeline crucial for transporting South Sudan's crude oil abroad was badly damaged. It led to the local currency plunging against the US dollar.
This issue of the dollar has badly affected my business. Now my stall is almost empty, but in the past you could not find my table empty like this. My stall used to be full of goods.
Petroleum exports account for about 90% of South Sudan's GDP. Lawmakers say the landlocked East African country was losing about 70% of its oil revenues since the pipeline ruptured.
It is an impact that cannot be denied, and it is very clear. You have seen now our country is suffering. We have less money, we have less services. Our security is a problem because we cannot afford the maintenance of security. So it is a great impact. It's a great impact, and it's going to continue doing that for a longer period until an amicable solution is found.
But rampant corruption in this young country is also draining its coffers. Political instability and a postponed general election are only adding to its economic vulnerability. And with the war next door exacerbating the situation here, many worry that the sharp decline in trade could lead to further turmoil in the region. Rahul Radhakrishnan, Africa Matters.
There is a great anticipation in Kenya as its athletes make their final preparations for the Paris Olympics. 83 athletes will represent the country in France, participating in 6 disciplines. But there are also doping concerns and calls for transparency for the delegation accompanying the team, as Claire Heriot reports.
Kenya has produced world-class athletes for years. It's the most decorated African nation in Olympic history, successful across a range of disciplines. The jewel in its crown is the athletics team, which has high hopes for Paris.
This was the best trials we have ever had so far in terms of organization, in terms of performance, because this is the first time that the athletes produced world leads, especially in 100 meters. Of course, you know 100 meters is the gem of athletics, yes, and the 800 meters too. I would say it's one of the best teams ever assembled. It's a young team.
But recently, a doping problem has tarnished its reputation. Since 2015, Kenya has been under the highest level of surveillance by the World Anti-Doping Agency. 270 Kenyan athletes have been barred from competition between 2015 and late last year. The Athletics Integrity Unit's latest sanctions for doping and non-doping violations show that 11 Kenyans will sit out the Games this year. President William Ruto congratulated members of the team before they left for Paris, but some have criticised the number of non-athletes travelling with them. People are concerned about the cost to the taxpayer and are demanding a list of all those accompanying the team to be made public. The Kenyan team won 10 medals last time round in Tokyo, including 4 gold. They'll be hoping to surpass that in Paris as they compete in other sports including fencing, judo men's rugby and women's volleyball. But ultimately, they'd like to maintain the country's reputation as a running powerhouse. Claire Herriot, Africa Matters.
That's our show this week. Share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode, or ideas on what you'd like us to cover on YouTube or on X using the hashtag Africa Matters. Thanks for watching, and it's Kwaheri from me, Brenda Radido.